to the first Sunday in Lent. This, as we've talked a little bit about colors and questions, this is the season of preparation. We prepare for Easter by entering deeply into the Paschal mystery, the life, death, and resurrection of Jesus Christ. This is the season where we intentionally reflect on what it means to follow a God who died on a cross and rose again into new life. Like Jesus in today's gospel, our Lenten practices are about our 40 days in the wilderness. They echo the scriptures. Jesus went into the desert right after he was baptized. He went before his public ministry. We too are given that space and time. Many of us have been baptized, but this is the season by which we can recall that baptism or perhaps inquire into our hearts of what a commitment to Christ might look like. In the desert, Jesus is tempted. Now, these tests are not about a God who seeks to manipulate us at all. They're not about finding the right answer. They are a scriptural witness to the reality of what it means to be human. These are the tests not in a conventional sense, but to the ongoing struggle of life, seeking between God's way and the world's way, between striving for a life where we set ourselves at the pinnacle of things, or we choose God and live according to God's way and God's vision for abundant life. This step of choosing our way or God's way is at the heart of our first reading from Genesis. In Genesis, we have the familiar story of Adam and Eve in the garden. They are told by God that they may eat of all the fruit except one. They cannot eat the fruit of the tree in the middle of the garden. Now, think in your mind, picture the fruit. What kind of fruit? You say the apple. I want to remind you that nowhere in the Hebrew telling of this story is the fruit named. It never says apple. Part of how we read Scripture is it gets interpreted by generations after the authors who wrote it. In this case, an apple. It also never ever uses a word for sin. That too is something, and our understanding of sin is something that the future tradition put back into this story. We have it today. Paul, just a teeny bit after Jesus' ministry, says we are told sin came into the world through one man, Adam. So this process of interpretation, it starts from the very beginning. But what is it that we overlay? Sin, as we have come to name it over the years, is not a specific act, but actually a commentary on what it means to be human. We are told by the chapters just before this story that God created the light and the darkness, the heavens and the earth, and that we are part of a creation that was made in God's image and likeness, and that creation was good. But in this second creation story, we have the other side. Because we all know that all of us are never good all of the time. Quite the contrary. We know that the worst of who we are in the world is also part of our story of what it means to be human. We say these words in the confession of sin. God of all mercy, we confess that we have sinned against you, opposing your will in our lives. We have denied your goodness in each other, in ourselves, and in the world you have created. Sin, as we understand it, is in our world and what it means to be human as well. The test or the temptation in the story of Adam and Eve is whether we will live according to the ways of God and how God has set for us. Do not eat the fruit in the middle of the garden, or whether we will live according to our own way. That fruit is our choice, to go against God, to go our own way, or to choose God. In Matthew's gospel story, Jesus is even tempted 3 times. In all 3 temptations, the devil is asking him to use his power for his own sake, for his own gain. Jesus is tempted to forget that he is a beloved child of God. The first temptation, if you are the Son of God, command these stones to become loaves of bread, is to control nature and to produce goods for our own consumption. We can ask in what way we as individuals or as a society are faced with this temptation. Do we hear the devil when we consume more than our share of material goods? The second temptation, if you were the Son of God, throw yourself down from this mountain, is a testing of God. Do we hear the devil when we bargain with God? God, if only you will do X or Y for me, I promise I will live better. I will pray all the prayers. I will give to the poor. Just do X or Y. The third temptation, when the devil offers Jesus the kingdoms of the world, do we hear being offered success, glory, but know that if we say yes to it, we will lose our soul? These are the temptations in general that we need to ask as well. But I also want to point out that today, particularly right here in Lake Oswego, we have a great temptation. It's called fear. Whether being stoked against racial groups or others, fear is being harnessed in our society. The arrival of the first case of the coronavirus in Oregon is at our doorsteps. It creates a type of incubator for fear. Misinformation abounds, as do agitators who seek to take advantage of our fears, spreading hate and chaos. The uptick of violence against Asian people only grows worse day by day. Just yesterday, there were incidents and attacks in both New York and LA. The agitators trade on the legacy of a shared history of racial fear toward Asian ethnicities. Think back. Among the many laws that both exploited and then restricted Chinese during the middle of the 19th century was the Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882. It, once the expanding gold rush, etc., started contracting, when people looked around and saw a pie that they didn't think was big enough for everyone, they institutioned this law to restrict Chinese from bringing their families over. It was the very first time in U.S. history that an immigration regulation targeted a specific ethnic group. Or perhaps we can come closer to our living memory. Do you recall the fears in World War II that led to internment camps? When the Japanese lost their farms and their property and their businesses, they certainly did in Seattle and Portland and San Francisco, up and down the West Coast. Now, what may not be known as well is a smaller number of people, German and Italian, under that same law, were taken to Texas. When we have enemies, we have fears. Fears bring out the worst of us in large ways and small ways. I am told that by people that here around us in the stores in the Portland metro area, that there is panic buying. Shelves are empty in some of our local stores. While yes, it is prudent to prepare, fear brings hoarding and panic. The Surgeon General Jerome M. Adams on Saturday urged the public to stop buying masks, warning that it won't help against the spread of the virus, but it will take away important resources. He tweeted out, "Seriously, people, stop buying masks. They are not effective in preventing general public from catching coronavirus." Timing not met. But if, but if healthcare providers can't get them to care for sick patients, it puts them and our communities at risk. Thank you. Fear is the great temptation. While there may be many famous quotes, and there are several, I checked, about what the fear can be, you might think of Roosevelt or Churchill, something to the effect of, all we have to fear is fear itself. Personally, my favorite comes from Frank Herbert. It is a litany, and it comes from the classic sci-fi Dune. And if you know anything about this story, the main protagonist has to go through a test, and it is a mind spiritual test in order to be able to come and walk the destiny he is meant to walk. And this is the litany. I must not fear. Fear is the mind killer. Fear is the little death that brings total obliteration. I will face my fear. I will permit it to pass over me and through me. And when it is gone past, I will turn the inner eye to see its path. Where the fear has gone, there will be nothing. Only I will remain. I do not know whether the coronavirus will pass as quickly as it came or whether it will be around for a while. I do know that all of us here in this church are called to follow the way of Jesus Christ. We are called in a particular way to show up this Lent. We are called to embody God's love for the world. So may we live without fear, and may we live in God's love. Amen.